All right, good morning. My name is Dan Friedman. I'm a data center technical solutions architect. I work with Cisco's America's Partner Organization, supporting partners in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And this presentation is intended to be an introduction to Intersight Kubernetes service, otherwise known as IKS. The presentation is suitable for business and technical audiences, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. So for our agenda, we're going to cover why we need something like Intersight Kubernetes service. We're going to discuss the specifics of what IKS is. We're going to go over some high-level and even a little bit of low-level IKS architecture, and then I will point you at some resources that you can use for further information. So first off, why do we need Intersight Kubernetes service? Well, as it turns out, Kubernetes isn't a simple platform to install, secure, maintain, or manage, especially if you choose to install your own Kubernetes cluster on bare metal to get maximum performance. Installing your own on-prem cluster on bare metal is pretty laborious. You've got to install your client tools, provision compute resources and per host SSH keys, provision network resources, including network or host firewall rules, public IPs for external load balancing, provision your certificate authority, generate and distribute your TLS certificates, generate and distribute Kubernetes config files for each Kubernetes service, services which include API server, scheduler, kubelet, kubeproxy, etc., to use your TLS certificates, generate data encryption and configuration keys, bootstrap the etcd cluster. That's a distributed data store which maintains state of all your cluster and deployed applications, which can either be stacked with your master nodes or deployed as a separate external cluster. You've got to bootstrap your master nodes, which serve as your control plane. You've got to bootstrap your worker nodes, which essentially serve as your data plane. They host all of your container-based workloads. And you've got to configure kubectl for remote access. In other words, there's challenges with doing Kubernetes yourself. Installing and maintaining network, storage, monitoring, logging, security, etc. These are all things that don't come out of the box with Kubernetes. So you've got to install plugins for your CNI, your container network interface, your CSI, your container storage interface. You've got to deploy your add-ons for things like DNS, your Kubernetes dashboard, metrics server, private image repository to store container images and config files, resource monitoring tools like Prometheus and Grafana, Helm for installing your applications, service mesh, and so on and so on. Upgrades and scaling of that type of Kubernetes cluster are manual actions. Manually adding more hosts, in other words, repeating all of the previously mentioned steps for deploying new master or worker nodes, and maintain and manage compatibility and upgrades for host operating system, Kubernetes service software versions, CNI and CSI plugins, add-ons, and finally your applications. And doing that all across several different environments such as dev, test, and prod amounts to a whole lot of work. So, in addition, you've got lack of support for standing up basically a custom cluster like that. You've got solution complexity, you've got solution resiliency, and in short, you have to build it, you have to secure it, you have to integrate it, you have to upgrade it, you have to scale it, and you have to support it, meaning you've got to manage all of your plugins and add-ons, you've got to manage all of your applications across those environments. Typically, when you're new to Kubernetes, people think that deploying one big cluster with different namespaces for all your different environments or applications is a good idea. However, it's not recommended for security reasons. So as an alternative, you want to manage all of your applications across multiple clusters, which means ultimately you wind up with cluster sprawl and basically a multiplication of the previously mentioned problems. Then you've got individual or intellectual lock-in around that entire mess. So with all of the benefits that the Kubernetes platform offers, some businesses have found that on-prem bare metal Kubernetes was so difficult that they're actually migrating away from it. And while that's one approach, That's why most Kubernetes clusters today run a custom Kubernetes distribution atop a VM layer. This is how all of the cloud service providers are doing it. This is how other Kubernetes management platforms are doing it, like Rancher as an example. So enter Intersight Kubernetes service. What is it? First, it's a software-based Kubernetes management platform. To put it simply, it allows you to install, upgrade, and maintain Kubernetes clusters, whether those clusters are on-premises or in the public cloud. On-premises is supported today, and public cloud support is coming in the near future. For on-prem, we currently support vCenter, and we also support IWE. We're going to discuss IWE a little bit more, but basically what that is a modified KVM hypervisor developed by Cisco, which serves as an alternative. It runs on top of HyperFlex hardware and provides the hypervisor layer that we need to install containers on. So let's take a look at the solution components of IKS. IKS includes a SaaS-based control plane, which means that there's nothing for you to install, secure, upgrade, or maintain. This piece is handled for you entirely by Cisco. All you need to do is purchase an Intersight Advantage license, license it per host CPU for the clusters that you plan to deploy, enable the licensing from Intersight, and your control plane is up and running. So by control plane here, we're referring to the Intersight UI from which you will configure, deploy, and manage all of your K8s clusters. We're not really referring to the master nodes in your K8s clusters, which provide the brains for container orchestration. That's because in this model, those master nodes are lumped in with worker nodes and delivered together as the data plane, which will host your container-based workloads. So how do we deploy the data plane, which will host these container-based workloads? First, you install and claim an Intersight appliance on premises in the data center, which will host your Kubernetes cluster. Now, if you don't know what an Intersight appliance is, then please watch my other video, Introduction to Intersight, where we talk more about basic Intersight architecture. After you've got your Intersight Assist appliance deployed, then you can claim the hypervisor manager, where your K8s master and worker node VMs will get deployed to, and that's obviously assuming you're going to do that onto, say, a vCenter. Then you configure a K8s cluster profile within Intersight. This is where you determine the number of master nodes, worker nodes, resources for each of those types of nodes, the Kubernetes version, the add-ons you wish to deploy to the cluster, etc. Then you deploy the Kubernetes cluster profile, and the entire deployment process is automated for you. So how is deployment achieved with vCenter? First, Intersight pushes a VM template down to vCenter, and then it clones that into the master and worker nodes that are needed for the cluster. The base operating system that's part of the VM template is Ubuntu. Once the VM operating systems are online, 100% upstream Kubernetes software is installed onto the operating system. All the certificate, security, and host SSH key configuration is automated. All the CNI and CSI plugins are automatically installed. For CNI, we use Calico by default. And all the add-ons that you selected in your Kubernetes cluster profile are automatically installed. So if that's how deployment is achieved with vCenter, then how is it achieved with the alternative hypervisor provided by Cisco, which is IWE, or Intersight Workload Engine? IWE can currently only be deployed to compatible HyperFlex hardware, so this is currently a bare metal solution as opposed to vCenter, which is VM-based. When IWE is selected, you'll have to target an HX cluster for deployment. Intersight will lay down Linux and the modified KVM hypervisor, otherwise known as IWE, on the HX compute nodes. Once the bare metal server operating systems are online, 100% upstream Kubernetes software is installed on the operating system, similar to how it was achieved in the virtual deployment. Again, all the certificate, security, and host SSH key configuration is automated. All the CNI and CSI plugins are automatically installed. All the add-ons you selected in your Kubernetes cluster profile are automatically installed. Now, I mentioned 100% upstream Kubernetes cluster, and that's a differentiator for us. Why is that? It's because most other Kubernetes management platforms use their own custom K8s distributions. So for example, something like VMware Tanzu, what this means is once you deploy a Kubernetes cluster with Tanzu, you can only manage it with Tanzu. With IKS, once you deploy a Kubernetes cluster with Intersight, if you're no longer using Intersight, you can still use standard and potentially other tools or platforms to onboard and manage your cluster. Something else that's worth mentioning here, right, is not today, but in the future, IKS will also be able to onboard Kubernetes clusters that were deployed outside of Intersight IKS. We make Kubernetes cluster deployment and management easy for you, but we don't lock you in. So speaking of VMware, if you're like most businesses that are tired of the VMware tax, as we've already mentioned, instead of using vCenter, you can use IWE, which is Cisco's free modified KVM hypervisor that's capable of running VMs, containers, and serverless workloads. Now that all of this has been deployed, you can leverage other components of Intersight to deploy your container-based applications onto your clusters. Things like Intersight Cloud Orchestrator, or ICO, or Intersight Service for Terraform, and there's some capability with regards to Helm for application deployment that is in the product roadmap. I don't have any more specifics on that at this time. As you can use your Kubernetes cluster profile within Intersight to handle other cluster operations tasks, things such as scaling up or scaling down the number of cluster nodes, or you can delete your entire cluster by deleting all of the nodes. You can also upgrade your version of Kubernetes. In this case, nodes go through a rolling update. Your control nodes will essentially create new nodes, switch old nodes to passive and delete them. Your worker nodes, they'll create new nodes and delete old nodes as the new workers become ready. You can also add, delete, or update your add-ons, etc. Given that the most secure way to deploy Kubernetes today is to have a separate cluster for each environment, things like dev, test, and prod, where multiple applications may be deployed into the default namespace for dev and test and separate namespaces per app for prod, you're going to have several clusters to manage either on-prem or in the public cloud. You may wish to spin up a cluster just for testing, then spin it down again. All such clusters can be lifecycle managed through Intersight with IKS. And let's keep in mind, even though we've been talking about predominantly on-prem, as that's what the IKS solution was initially built to support, we do have support for deployment of the same Kubernetes clusters and management capabilities within public cloud providers coming to the product soon via the roadmap. In addition, all workloads can be optimized through Intersight with IWO, Intersight Workload Optimizer, and container applications can be monitored using Application Dynamics, AppD. For licensing, one Intersight Platform Advantage license is required per CPU for the hosts that are going to be in your Kubernetes cluster. Plus, you're going to want basically an IKS feature license. Today, there's an Essentials license which covers your CNI and CSI, Cert Manager, Layer 4, Layer 7 load balancers, Kubernetes dashboard, monitoring, and add-on agents for Intersight Workload Optimizer, all baked in. Then in the future, there's going to be an IKS Advantage license, which is for advanced features that many of which are still under development. One such feature is SMM, which actually has already been released just recently. And then to manage your licenses, of course, you're going to need a smart account. So finally, keep in mind that the top container deployment challenges have to do with lack of skilled resources, operational complexity, and security concerns. But IKS addresses all of these concerns, and the entire stack comes with support from Cisco TAC. So this is a slide that talks to Kubernetes capabilities. So in the center, you've got Cisco Intersight, and then you can see on the left, you've got ESX or ESXi-based Hyperflex, so that's where you would attach to vCenter and do kind of a VM-based deployment of your Kubernetes cluster. Down in the middle, you've got Intersight Workload Engine, so just a different hypervisor, and then on top of that, you build your Kubernetes clusters. And then over on the far right, You've got your cloud service providers or public cloud functionality that will be coming to the product soon. So let's talk a little bit about IKS architecture. So in terms of architectural components, first you've got Intersight, which is the SaaS-based platform. Again, if you don't know what the bigger picture of Intersight is, please watch my introduction to Intersight video as a prereq to watching this video. IKS is just a module of functionality within the larger platform of Intersight. So the SaaS deployment can be accessed at intersight.com. Now, what you'll do for on-premises anyway is to deploy an Intersight Assist appliance, and you typically deploy one of those per data center, and what you do is you claim it from Intersight, and that establishes a permanent WebSocket communication or a tunnel from intersight.com down to your Intersight Assist appliances that reside in your various data centers. Remember, you're going to deploy one of these per data center, and then it'll be used as a reverse proxy to speak to any third-party hardware or software that resides on premises, so things like vCenter. So obviously then you've got your hypervisor like I point out here, so you've got vCenter running on whatever hardware you want to run it on, or you've got the IWE hypervisor option running atop HyperFlex for now. Then for your public cloud, your hypervisor in that case would be AWS, Azure, or GCP, and remember those things are coming soon. They're not supported today. And then finally, within the Intersight SaaS UI, you're going to build out a Kubernetes cluster profile. And this is where you define a name for your profile and the different policies that the profile is going to use. For example, IP pools, DNS, NTP. You're going to define the version of Kubernetes software that you're going to run on your nodes. You're going to define the number of master and worker nodes, the resources assigned to those nodes, the add-ons that you want to deploy into your cluster, and so on. So basically you can determine the entire cluster configuration from your profile, and then you can set up a target and deploy that profile onto that hardware. Now for communications, all communications from Intersight are secured. When the Intersight Assist appliance is claimed from Intersight, it makes an outbound SSL call to intersight.com, and multi-factor authentication allows for that permanent tunnel, encrypted tunnel, to be authenticated. So and that is to say all of the communications from Intersight down to your Kubernetes clusters are going to be secured. So here's a quick diagram. Again, we see Cisco Intersight in the middle, and then for the public cloud providers on the right, since Intersight is a SaaS-based platform that lives on the internet, we can communicate directly with AWS, Azure, and Google APIs in the future. But for on-premises, which is shown on the left, that's where we need the Intersight Assist appliance, just to the left of Cisco Intersight in the center of the diagram here. So you'll deploy that in your data center, and then you'll claim it from Intersight. And so this small arrow here in the middle, this is your WebSocket SSL tunnel that goes back to your on-prem data center. And then the Intersight Assist appliance basically allows you to have a reverse proxy for you to claim third-party hardware. In this case, VMware vCenter, if you're choosing to deploy your Kubernetes cluster on top of vCenter, or Cisco IWE. This slide says future, but IWE was released recently, so this is actually supported currently. So here you can see your Kubernetes master and worker nodes, and atop one or the other hypervisor. So this basically shows the high-level architecture. Now for low-level architecture, I like this slide because on the left we see Cisco Intersight. So this is referring to the Intersight platform that you log into at intersight.com, and it basically provides the control plane. So these are features like automation, which would be, for example, deploying and conducting all of the steps necessary to build out your Kubernetes cluster on your various hypervisors. You've got orchestration of containers on top of those, And then you've got your operational capabilities that I discussed, things like upgrading your cluster or modifying your add-ons or changing or scaling your nodes. Okay, on the right, we have essentially we have your data plane. So you can deploy on top of ESX, you can deploy on top of Cisco IWE. In the future, you can deploy onto the cloud service provider hypervisors. And so once you deploy, in this example, onto VMware ESXi, then that VM template gets pushed down to vCenter, it gets cloned into these individual VMs that are running Ubuntu, right? And then we install Kubernetes software onto this layer here, right onto the Ubuntu VMs. And then we can go ahead and, with that software, build out our Kubernetes cluster. And then on top of that, we can run our container-based workloads and perform our operations against those workloads. So this kind of shows a little bit more detail around low-level architecture. This slide talks about the Kubernetes stack, which kind of involves a bunch of different things. So at the base layer, for your container storage interface, today you can use VMware. Hyperflex Data Platform is being added. We've already mentioned that for the operating system, we use Ubuntu as our base image. For our container network interface, we're using the Calico plugin. For load balancing, we're using Metal LB for layer 4 load balancing, and Nginx for layer 7 load balancing. And then, as I mentioned, right, we're installing 100% upstream Kubernetes software, which means you have no vendor lock-in with Cisco. If you've deployed this cluster with Intersight, you can later manage it with another platform if desired. On the right side, we see a selection of different add-ons that are available to deploy into your cluster. So things like the Kubernetes dashboard, if you need a visual representation or means of managing your cluster, as opposed to using a CLI-based tool like kubectl. You've got Prometheus and Grafana, which collect data and metrics from your cluster and then display it in a visual format that's easy to understand. You've got Kubeflow. I personally don't know a lot about this add-on. I just know that it's machine learning related. You've got Service Mesh Manager, which was recently released. You've got Intersight Workload Optimizer coming. That'll just be a native integration. But again, IWO allows you to basically analyze the performance, cost, and compliance of running your container-based workloads atop your cluster. And then Harbor is basically, I think that's an image repository. So these are all very common functionalities that people are looking for when they deploy their Kubernetes cluster, and so we want to be able to integrate that and make it part of the automated deployment. Okay, now in terms of Intersight Resources, you've got intersight.com, which, as I said, is the SaaS platform. You can create an account, you can start claiming your UCS equipment. With licensing, you can enable additional features like IKS. And if you want more information, you should visit intersight.com/help. It's got a ton of documents, it's got licensing information, it's got all sorts of different resources that will help you learn and understand and manage Intersight as a platform. You've also got dCloud. There's some demos that are available there. And you've got Intersight API, which brings up an important point, right? It's not just IT ops that consumes Intersight, it's also DevOps. As such, Intersight comes with a robust API, which you can start looking into at the corresponding link in the slide. Ultimately, you can deploy an entire Kubernetes cluster within the GUI. You can use Terraform to do it, you can use some form of CI/CD automation, or you can do it with a REST API called Intersight using our Python SDK. So with that, I want to say thank you. Appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Dan. I'm a Data Center TSA at Cisco. Thank you.